Okay, now the topic is called expansion of Buddhism. This is really a huge topic, so I'm not sure if I could do justice within this 45 minutes. So we'll see what we could do. All right, so expansion of Buddhism. Let's see, let me get those. Okay, so I'll have a few slides, so I'll just show some of those slides. We can see them. So first of all, let's look at Buddhism itself, all right? When we talk about expansion of Buddhism, so obviously for some people, Buddhism is a religion. And for others, it's a philosophy. Others practice it to find themselves and experience inner peace. His Holiness the Dalai Lama likes to regard Buddhism as a mind science. So whatever it is, Buddhism is something that is practiced worldwide. So based on this source, which I got called 2020 World Religion Review, it is said that as many as 500 million people around the world practice Buddhism, and this would represent something like about 8, maybe 10% of the world's total population. So in a way, it is a world religion. Now, if you look at the major concentration about Buddhism today, you see predominantly it is very much an Asian religion. You'll find the one in red is colored red. You have in Burma or Myanmar, in Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and then in Sri Lanka. So that follows what today we call Theravada Buddhism. Okay, and then you have got East Asian Mahayana, which is China, Korea, Japan. And then you have the orange, which what we would call the Tibetan Mahayana, right? So, and of course, right in Europe, you have Kalmykia, which is a Soviet republic, which is predominantly Buddhist in terms of the Tibetan tradition. So that's very much this spread. So the question is, how did Buddhism become the dominant religion or philosophy or way of life in this part of the world? Okay, so we shall look at that. Now, if you look at the spread of Buddhism, we're talking about 500 BC to 600 AD, right? Or if you use the Buddhist terminology, BCE and CE, Common Era, okay? So you have, I think Chi Seng earlier on mentioned about the Silk Road. So I'm not going to talk so much about that Silk Road itself. I think Victor will be speaking much more on that in subsequent sessions, okay? So I'm going to look at a couple of countries which were mentioned early on as where Buddhism is predominant. So let's start with Sri Lanka, okay? Now, of course, it's impossible for this session to go into details about how Buddhism started in Sri Lanka, and then, but what we could say is that in 246 BCE, that means before the Common Era, Ashoka, I think many of you know who King Ashoka was, the Mauryan emperor who became a Buddhist after what he has seen at the war in Kalinga. He became a Buddhist and became a king of peace. Now, it is said that Ashoka sent his son Mahinda to Sri Lanka, who then converted the king to Buddhism. At the same time, Ashoka's daughter, Sankhamita, brought a sapling of the original Bodhi tree to Sri Lanka and established an order of nuns. So Buddhism actually became the main religion by the 2nd century BCE. So I won't be able to go too much details on the history of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, but we can say that as of today, close to 70 to 71% of Sri Lankans are Buddhists. All right, so you can actually look at it as Buddhism in Sri Lanka as the longest continuous history of Buddhism in any Buddhist nation, because it was from Sri Lanka subsequently that Buddhism went to Southeast Asia. So the Sangha, or the monastic institution in Sri Lanka, have also existed in an unbroken lineage since its introduction to the country. Now, what is interesting, I just want to mention a little bit more about Sri Lanka here, is that Buddhism did not have an easy ride in the country, even though, you know, by the 2nd century, it was the main religion, because what happened is from the 16th century onwards, when the Portuguese and the Dutch missionaries, as well as British colonizers, attempted to convert the locals to Christianity. And then that's where there were wars between the Portuguese and the Allies with the local people, and that actually severely weakened the Sangha. But that was in the 16th century. So fast forward 300 years later, in the 19th century, Buddhism was actually was very weak in Sri Lanka at that time. But it was also a time where a national Buddhist movement began as a response to Christian evangelism. Now, some of you may have heard of this debate called the Panadura debate. The Panadura debate was, I think, in 1866. It was actually between Christian priests and Buddhist monks. All right, Buddhist monks like M. Gunananda and Sumangala Thera. And it was widely seen as a victory for the Buddhists. So that actually represents a change in fortunes for Buddhism in Sri Lanka. And so happened at that time, you have two Westerners by the name of Henry Steele Olcott, who came to Sri Lanka with Madame Blavatsky of the Theosophical Society. Now, these are very important events in Sri Lankan history, because what happened is now you've got two Westerners who are coming to Sri Lanka and telling the Sri Lankans that, hey, look, you have a wonderful tradition, you have a wonderful religion. Why are you giving it up? Because by the 19th century, many Sri Lankans had already been converted to Christians. So by then, because of the Panadura debate, it kind of evoked a new sense of pride in Buddhism as the indigenous religion in Sri Lanka. So this Buddhist revival actually was also led by the Anagarika Dhammapala. I think in the study of Sri Lankan Buddhism, the name Anagarika Dhammapala will always be in the forefront. Actually, there's another name who is actually Ashoka Viraratne. Now, what happened is these two missionaries, they established Buddhist temples in the West. So this is actually bringing Buddhism to the West, because Anagarika Dhammapala established the London Buddhist Vihara in 1926, and Ashoka Viraratne established the Berlin Buddhist Vihara. So you can see how the tide is slowly changing. Now the Sri Lankans are actually bringing Buddhism to the West, okay? And with the Buddhist revival in Sri Lanka, it also led to a rise of interest in Theravada Buddhism. Subsequently, some of you have heard about the Pali Text Society. So those are embryonic steps where Buddhism became known in the West, all right? And the study of Sri Lanka Buddhism, I think, would be quite incomplete for many of us today if we don't mention the names of three very important Western monastics. And the first name is Ñāṇatiloka, who studied in Sri Lanka, who established the Island Hermitage, and he actually ordained many Western monks, okay, at this place called the Island Hermitage. So Venerable Ñāṇatiloka is also the author of the very famous Buddhist dictionary. He's a German monk. And then we have got the British monk Ñāṇamoli, who together with Bhikkhu Bodhi, all right, was able to, to do the translations of some of the Buddhist texts, including the Majjhima Nikaya. And I'm sure you've heard of Ñāṇaponika, who actually started the Buddhist Publication Society with Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. Even Bhikkhu Bodhi himself, was stayed a fairly long period of time in Sri Lanka and advanced the Buddhist Publication Society. And one last point about Buddhism in Sri Lanka, I think I would just like to mention, is that it is in Sri Lanka that, for example, efforts to revive the Bhikkhuni Sangha, the order of nuns in Theravada tradition, actually started. All right, this was in 1996 through the efforts of Sakyadhita. All right, so I thought it is important for us to look at Sri Lanka in its contemporary lens by saying that even though Buddhism had been there since the 3rd century BCE, but by the 15th, 16th century, it has been severely weakened. But again, there was a revival, right, in the 19th century. So names Anagarika Dhammapala, and subsequently you have the very famous three Western monks, Ñāṇatiloka, Ñāṇamoli, and Ñāṇaponika. So in a way, went back to the local Sri Lankans and kind of gave them the assurance that, look, you have got a wonderful tradition. All right, so hold on to it. Okay, so that's Sri Lanka. Okay, so of course the other name which is always associated with Sri Lanka is Buddha Ghosha, right? Who was Indian from South India. He went to Sri Lanka. He wrote the Visuddhimagga, and the study of Theravada Buddhism is actually incomplete. If one does not study the Visuddhimagga, even though it is a commentary written in the 5th century. Okay, now the second country I thought I would just touch very briefly is actually Burma or Myanmar. Now it is also believed that King Ashoka actually sent monks to Myanmar or Tathon, which was a trading center in the southern part of Burma at that time to spread the Dhamma. But by the 1st century, the Common Era, Buddhism was really widely accepted by the people in Tathon as more Buddhist missionaries arrived from India. History has recorded that by 11th century, there was already strong aspects of Buddhism, but there was also a mix of Vajrayana and Hinduism. Okay, now Buddhism became very active under this king called King Anuruddha, who was this in the 11th century. It was during this period that Theravada Buddhism began to flourish, and King Anuruddha actually made Buddhism the state religion. And it is said he brought Buddhist texts and relics from Sri Lanka and began to build temples in the capital city of Pagan. Today, if you get a chance to visit Burma, you'll find that it's thousands of pagodas. To fast forward, in the 15th century, Sri Lankan monks actually helped to strengthen monasticism in Burma. Right? So it was a period of time when the Sangha was again weakened, and then through the assistance of Sri Lankan monks, they helped to strengthen monasticism in Burma. Okay, so before I go to Thailand, I thought I'd just mention a little bit about the modern aspects of Buddhism in Burma. Today, we know that there are some 90% of the country's population is considered Buddhist, and of course, predominantly Theravada. Now, just like in other Theravada countries, you've got two very popular practices, particularly in Myanmar and Burma. One is, of course, the traditional merit making, doing dana. But the second major contribution of Burma or Myanmar to modern Buddhism is actually in the area of vipassana meditation. Okay, in fact, two very famous names when we study about Buddhism in Myanmar that comes to mind will be Ledi Sayadaw and Mahasi Sayadaw. All right. So now, both of them actually promoted vipassana even to the laity. All right. So even the lay people became exposed to the practices of vipassana. Previously, it was something which only the monastics would have access to, but today you find that vipassana meditation is a common practice, and thanks very much to the efforts of two very important Myanmar or Burmese monks, Ledi Sayadaw and Mahasi Sayadaw. So I think these two names are really very important. Okay. Now, of course, lately, for the past couple of years, you also read about monks protesting in Myanmar, in the country, against the government. All right, so you find that even in Myanmar itself, the concept of engaged Buddhism is also very much there. Okay, so that's Burma or Myanmar. Now the other one. Okay, let's go to Thailand. For Thailand, Theravada was established in Thailand in the 13th century by King Ramkhamhaeng. This was like in Sukhothai. All right, so it is said that he sent monks to study Buddhism in Sri Lanka. So having a look at both Myanmar and Sri Lanka, so here we know that Sri Lanka is like the mother country that gave birth to Theravada Buddhism. Okay, so later Thai kings gave the full support to Theravada Buddhism, and two kings in particular Just as in Burma or Myanmar, you have King Anuruddha. So in Thailand, two kings are very important that actually helps to promote Buddhism. That's King Mongkut in the 19th century, both in the 19th century, King Mongkut from 1804 to 68, and King Chulalongkorn. Okay, so these two kings gave great impetus to the spread of Buddhism in Thailand. Now, I'd just like to mention a little bit about Thailand before we look at Cambodia. So again, like Burma or Myanmar, the population of Buddhists in Thailand is estimated to be above 90%. So it's almost like the whole country is Buddhist, Theravada Buddhist. Okay. Now, I just want to mention briefly that today what you have is a reform movement that despite the fact that Buddhism was very strong in Thailand, yet there were occasions in Thai Buddhist history where King Mongkut, for example, felt that Buddhism needs to be re-energized, that Buddhism needs to go back to its basic fundamentals. So this was when actually King Mongkut started a monastic order called the Dhamma. So today in Thailand, you actually have got two major monastic traditions. One is the Mahanikai or Mahanikaya, and the other is the Dhamma. Okay, so the Dhamma was started much later in 1833 as a reform movement. It is a reform movement because King Mongkut noticed serious discrepancies between what is supposedly mentioned or practiced in the Pali Canon with the actual practices of Thai monks. So King Mongkut actually wanted to upgrade monastic discipline to make it more orthodox, to make it more in line with the Pali Canon. And King Mongkut tried to remove all non-Buddhist, all the folk religious and superstitious elements. Okay, so that was the background behind the Dhamma tradition. Okay, so like for example, if you go to Thailand, you'll find that some of the temples you'll be able to associate them. Or these temples are actually in the lineage of the Dhamma, like Wat Bovon, like Bovonives. So that's a Dhamma temple. Okay, but there are also very good monks. For example, in the Mahanikai. Achancha, for example, he's from the Mahanikai order. Okay, so we have got both traditions today in Thailand. Now, the other reform movement which came subsequently is, some of you may have heard, is called the Dhammakaya movement. Now, this was started in the early 20th century by Longpo Chandasaro. Okay, so the tradition is revivalist in nature and practices meditation. Now, just as the Dhamma, the Dhammakaya also opposes the magical rituals, the superstitions, the folk elements of Thai Buddhism, fortune telling, giving lottery numbers, and the focus is on an active style of propagating the Dhamma and giving lottery numbers and practicing meditation. Okay, so they were against giving lottery numbers and so on. So a lot of emphasis on meditation, ensuring that meditation is taught to the laity. Okay, so that's the Dhammakaya movement. Even though subsequently, it ran into some controversy. Okay, we can talk about it if there's time. Now, the other reform movement I thought I should also mention when one studied Thai Buddhism is the Santi Asok group, the Santi Asok movement, which was established by Prab Bodhirat after he declared independence from the Thai Sangha Council in 1975. Okay, Santi Asok has been described as a transformation of the forest monk revival in the 1920s and 1930s. So it is more radical than the Dhammakaya movement in terms of its criticism of the Thai society, and it has got its own details of its own vision of what it constitutes a truly religious and moral community. Okay, but today Santi Asok is no longer that active compared to way back in the 1980s. All right, but it was another period in Thai history. Okay, the last one, which is lesser known but still an an active one is called the Sekiya Dhamma Sangha. Now, this is a group of activist monks which focus primarily on modern issues in Thailand. Now, what are those issues? Issues like deforestation, poverty, drug addiction, AIDS, and so on. So it's a very recent, it started way back in 1989, 1990, among a growth of Buddhist social activism in Thailand. Okay, so these are what you would call Buddhist social activists and participating in engaged Buddhist practices. So you'll find that also in Thailand. Now, Cambodia and Laos, these are also strong Buddhist countries. So Cambodia, by the end of the 4th century, Buddhism has spread throughout Cambodia. But in Cambodia, subsequent 2 centuries, the rulers practiced Hinduism, but they also gave support to Mahayana Buddhism. For example, if you were to go to visit Angkor, all right, you'll be surprised, you will still see semblance of Hindu elements as well as Buddhism. Okay, so so that's Cambodia. All right. Now, Cambodia also has got a difficult history in terms of Buddhism. While it became very strong in the country, but we also know that when the Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia, the group killed many monks, defrocked many monks, and killed and destroyed Buddhism to a large extent. Okay, it was only after the Khmer Rouge were rooted, all right, then Buddhism came back. And today, Buddhism is again recognized as the official religion of Cambodia. So look at all these seemingly Buddhist countries today, they have gone through very, very difficult periods, right, in history. So that's Cambodia. So just as Cambodia is considered as today 96% Buddhist, likewise in Laos, all right, the population of Buddhists is also huge, all right, way above 70%. So Thai Buddhism is very much closely associated with Laos, and you can find that the Lao Sangha actually follow closely that of Thailand. Okay, in fact, many monks went to Thailand to study. Okay, so that's Laos. Now, just as before I look at Indonesia, just as Cambodia went through a difficult period under the Khmer Rouge, in Laos there was also a certain period when the communists were actually in control, and that was through the Pathet Lao. All right, some of you may have heard about the Pathet Lao. Okay, so but today Laos is very much also considered a Buddhist country. Okay, now let's look at Indonesia. Now, Indonesia is, of course, today the world's largest Muslim country. All right, it's the world's largest Muslim country, but Buddhism has a long history in Indonesia. And what is interesting is that Buddhism is also recognized as one of 6 official religions in Indonesia, along with Islam, Christianity, Protestantism and Catholicism under Christianity, Hinduism, and Confucianism. But according to the recent census, less than 1% of the people in Indonesia are Buddhist. All right? So compared to the first few countries in Southeast Asia which we have mentioned, like Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand, where the population are predominantly Buddhist, but in Indonesia you only have less than 1%. And the majority of Buddhists in Indonesia are actually the Chinese, even though small numbers of natives, including Javanese Buddhists, are also present. Okay. Now, what is interesting about Indonesia is that because of the government's emphasis on Pancasila, all right, whenever there is a official government functions, you find that a Buddhist monk representing the Buddhist Sangha, along with a priest, a Christian priest, maybe a Brahmin, a pastor, or a representative of another religious tradition, would also participate, especially if it is a state-sponsored ceremony. So you have a ceremony with a prayer, maybe led by a Muslim imam, and then you have got representatives from various Buddhists and Hindus and Christians. Okay, so Indonesia 5th century, already you have Indian Buddhist monks who came to Java. All right? So Buddhism was already known as early as the 5th century. Okay? And it is said that in the 7th century, when this Chinese pilgrim, I Ching, visited Sumatra, which was part of Sri Vijaya, obviously we don't have time to go into to discuss the great empire of Sri Vijaya under the Sailendras. Buddhism was already widely accepted, and Palembang was the center of Buddhist learning. Okay, so these were under the Sailendra kings. Now, what we have today will be, of course, Borobudur. All right, so they built various Buddhist monuments in Java, the most famous being Borobudur, which was completed in the 9th century. Now, one more point I'd like to mention when we studied Indonesia was this name, Atisha. Those of you who practice Tibetan Buddhism, you would be familiar with this name, Atisha Dipankara, who was actually an Indian monk from Bengal who visited Sumatra, stayed many years in Sumatra to learn from a great local master called Selingpa. It was Atisha who subsequently invited by the king of Tibet, went to Tibet and revived Buddhism in Tibet and started what today we would call the Kadampa tradition. In fact, His Holiness the Dalai Lama's tradition, the Gelugpa, actually you can trace it back to the Lama Atisha. So Atisha is a great teacher from India who was in Indonesia, stayed many years in Indonesia, and then went to Tibet. So that is the legacy that we have in Indonesia. Now, Malaysia. If we look at Malaysia, again, Buddhism has been here since as early as the 2nd or even the 3rd or even 2nd century before the Common Era, based on Buddhist archaeological excavations. And the Buddhist texts spoke about 2 Buddhist monks, even names were given, Sona and Uttara, having visited Malaya during the 3rd century BCE. And there are archaeological evidence, for example, those of you who, many of today's participants are from Malaysia. I'm sure you know where Bujang Valley is in Kedah. So you trace back the origin of Bujang Valley. Historical and archaeological records trace it as early as the 2nd, if not 3rd century. Okay. So likewise, the other sources about Buddhism in Malaysia would be Chinese written sources. If you look at Chinese written sources, they mention something like 30 small Indianized states that rose and fell in the Malay Peninsula. Okay, so a very good source is George Sedez, right, who wrote the book called Indianized Kingdoms in Southeast Asia. So that is a give you some evidence about the early arrival of Buddhism in Malaysia. In fact, in the 7th century, I Ching, he also described Sri Vijaya having over 1,000 Buddhist monks. And from the 8th to 13th century, Malaya was actually under the Sri Vijaya Empire based in Sumatra. Okay, so the Malay Peninsula or Malaya was then introduced to Buddhist custom and traditions of the Thais. Okay, so we have both influence from Indonesia as well as from Thailand. Okay, so Malaysia, today, the fact that we have it is said that we have about 20% population who are Buddhists. All right, so in terms of percentage, it's much higher than Indonesia, and that's because many of the present day Buddhists are actually Chinese immigrants who came from South China to work in the tin mines and to work in the retail sector during the time of the British. And we also have got what they call the Sri Lankans, as the Sinhalese and the Tamils from Sri Lanka coming over, as well as the Thais in the northern part of the country. Okay. So the study of Malaysian Buddhism, modern Malaysian Buddhism, would be actually quite incomplete if names like Venerable K. Sri Dhammananda and Venerable K. Gunaratana are not mentioned, because they were the ones who actually promoted Theravada Buddhism in Malaysia. But this was much later, like in the 1950s, 1940s. All right. Likewise, in the Chinese Mahayana tradition, Some of you may be familiar with names like Venerable Chukmo, all right, a famous Chinese Zen master based in Penang, all right, who was also instrumental in spreading authentic, I would say, authentic Orthodox Chinese Mahayana Buddhism in Malaysia. All right, so Venerable Chukmo. So these are names, all right, which any study of Malaysian Buddhism would be incomplete if we do not know who this great master were. Okay. So if we look at the, okay, I want to skip and go look at Vietnam. Now, Vietnam, it is said that Chinese monks visited North Vietnam during the 2nd century CE. Later, when we look at China, it is said that Buddhism entered China around the 1st century. So this is about 100 years later. So we have records of Chinese monks visiting North Vietnam during the 2nd century. And then later, Indian and Central Asian monks arrived by land and sea. And it is said that those who worship the native deities practice Pure Land Buddhism, while Chan, which is the Japanese Zen, or in Vietnam it's called Tien, flourished in the monasteries and among Buddhist scholars. So Vietnam, okay? Now, South Vietnam, so if you look at Vietnam today, it's a very long country. If North Vietnam was exposed to Chinese influence or Chinese aspects of Buddhism, South Vietnam was more exposed to Indian influence from the beginning of the 1st century. But both Mahayana and Hinduism were practiced there. It was only after the 15th century, right, that the South was gradually assimilated by the powerful North, and Chinese Buddhism became the main influence throughout the country. So Vietnam is predominantly a Mahayana country, unlike, say, Thailand, Burma, Cambodia, or Laos. Okay. Now, the study of Vietnam, again, Buddhism has also experienced some very tragic periods in history. Okay, especially in modern history. Many of you would remember, maybe some of you were too young, some may not even be born, right? In the early 1960s, all right, there was a Vietnamese president called Nguyen Dien Diem, who actually prohibited Buddhism or prohibited Buddhists from displaying even Buddhist flags during Wesak. So there was a lot of restriction on Buddhist practices. And of course, this led to widespread protests against the government, and the troops at that time, which was South Vietnam, were sent in and many civilians were killed. So it was a period which led to a great crisis in Vietnamese Buddhism, and this culminated in Buddhism being also weakened in the country, right? And subsequently, when Vietnam fell to the communists in 1975, so the whole nation came under communist rule. So again, under communism, Buddhism did not fare any much better, okay? But it was only subsequently, 10, 20 years after peace came back to Vietnam, that the government began to be more open to Buddhism. And they began to realize that, just as in China, that Buddhism is associated with a long and deep history of Vietnam, okay? And there was little disputes with that. And they also realized that Buddhism was not a violent religion, okay? So then Buddhist festivals were subsequently being promoted with few restrictions compared to other religions, okay? In fact, since then, the government of Vietnam today, they have actually allowed major Buddhist figures to enter the country. Some of you may even remember that the well-known Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh was actually allowed to actually enter the country, okay? So Vietnam has also gone through different periods, okay? So let's move on because time is catching up, right? We have China. Now, China, again, it's not doing justice by spending 5 minutes to talk about Buddhism, expansion of Buddhism in China. But we know that from records that traders and monks brought Buddhism to China in the 1st century. All right, so this name, An Shigo, for example, a monk from Central Asia, came to China to translate texts into Chinese. So this marked the very first beginning of Buddhism in China. And it is said that by the 6th century, there was some 2 million Buddhists, all right? Actually, I was just listening to a Chinese TV broadcast. The host was actually interviewing Venerable Yifa. I think some of you know Venerable Yifa from Fo Guangshan, and Venerable Chen Guang, who was one of the earliest Buddhist chaplains in the U.S. Army. And during that conversation, I remember that the host says in China there was like about 500 million Buddhists. All right, so that's huge. All right. So in 514, in the 6th century, there were only about 2 million Buddhists, okay? Now, one of the most famous translators, I think we should all remember, his name is Kumarajiva, okay? So this is a great translator. It was Kumarajiva who actually did a lot of translations of scriptures, right, into Chinese. Now, Buddhism reached its peak during the Tang dynasty in particular, all right? Now, another name which is very well-known is Bodhidharma. Why? Because Bodhidharma came from India and founded what is called Zen Buddhism. Okay, there's a lot of interesting stories about Bodhidharma, right? We don't have time to talk about it, all right? So it's from Bodhidharma, you got Zen Buddhism. Today you have the Shaolin tradition. So the Shaolin tradition is also traced to Zen Buddhism, for example, Bodhidharma. Now, China has shaped, you can say in China, Buddhism has shaped both Chinese culture and tradition, okay? But throughout history, Buddhism, again, like in all the other countries which I've just mentioned, Buddhism in China has also faced support from the royalty, from the kings, as well as serious persecution under various leaders. However, Buddhism had remained strong, and now it has the world's largest Buddhist population, okay? Now, if you look at Buddhism in China, of course, it is what we would call Mahayana Buddhism. And Buddhism in China is represented by 4 main Buddhist schools, all right? We have what we call the Pure Land Jingdu, all right, which focuses on Amitabha, all right, or the Pure Land school, right, the Amitabha school. Then you got Chan, which is in Japan became Zen, all right, this is the meditation school. And then you got the Tiantai, and then you got the Huayan. Huayan is the Avatamsaka in Sanskrit. In Japan, it became the Qigong school, all right? So these are the 4 main schools of Buddhism in China, all right? The Pure Land, Chan, Tiantai, and Huayan, okay? Now, the modern China, for example, is still very much a communist country, all right? But what is interesting is that in 2006, the Chinese government hosted what is called the World Buddhist Forum in Hangzhou, right? Some of you may have heard about this. It was the first major international religious conference in China, or Buddhist conference in China, since the communists took over in 1949. And during this World Buddhist Forum, more than 1,000 monks and experts on Buddhism from 37 countries were invited to attend the forum, giving speeches, participating in discussions under the theme of a harmonious world begins in the mind. All right? So you can see even in China itself, the government, while it is officially atheistic, has got kind of a soft spot for Buddhism. All right? So because of that, Buddhism is able to grow. Earlier, I mentioned about Venerable Yifa. So through the Fo Guangshan group, so they're now very active in promoting Buddhism in China. But interestingly enough, there's a new book out. It's called Tibetan Buddhism Among Han Chinese by Joshua Esler from a university in Western Australia. In Joshua's book called Tibetan Buddhism Among Han Chinese, his premise is that because China have reached a stage of a high state of materialism, many of the young people are now actually turning to Buddhism. And the form of Buddhism they're turning to actually is Tibetan Buddhism. All right, so it's interesting. Well, again, we don't have time to go into that. Very interesting subject. If you are really keen on this, I recommend you this book by Joshua Esler called Tibetan Buddhism Among Han Chinese. All right. So Tibetan Buddhism is popular not only in the West, but also in China itself. Okay, so I'm going to skip this part of China and move to Korea. Now, Buddhism in Korea was introduced from China. So it is said that a Chinese monk in 4th century CE brought Buddhism to Korea. All right. And by the 6th century, Buddhism had reached the Silla kingdom. And by the 6th and 7th century, Korean monks went to China to study and bring back texts of various Chinese Buddhist schools. Now, when the Silla Empire unified the 3 kingdoms in the 7th century, so Buddhism flourished. So in the 7th century, Buddhism flourished under royal patronage. And in the 10th century, when the Silla was replaced by the Kokyo dynasty, Buddhism reached the height of its importance. So with royal support, more monasteries were built and more works of art were produced. So the Silla Empire and the Koryo Empire, those were considered as the height of Buddhism. But from the 14th century to the 19th century, Buddhism lost court support to Confucianism, which became the sole state religion. So Buddhism declined. All right, Buddhism lost support. And when the Yi dynasty fell to Japanese control, I think you would remember that Korea was under Japanese control for a long period of time. What happened is the Japanese Buddhist tradition introduced the married clergy. Now, this caused a split in the main Korean Jokye order, which is celibate. So you can imagine the harm that's been done to the traditional Korean monastic order, which was celibate. Now the Japanese brought in the married clergy. So what happened is you have today in Korea, both the celibate order, represented by the Jokye order, which is by far the largest, and the slightly smaller called the Taegu order, which has both the celibate as well as the married clergy. But Buddhism in modern Korean history also went through a difficult period, just like it went through in Japan. In Vietnam, when the presidents or the political leaders became Christians. All right, just as in Vietnam, President Nguyen Dinh Diem was a staunch Catholic. Likewise, in Korea, when Syngman Rhee became the president in the early 50s, he suppressed Buddhism, and Buddhism declined. And at the same time, he promoted Western education, empowerment of women and the poor. So this caused divisions among Koreans. So this deep split, again, between married priests and celibate monks, again, further weakened the Buddhist clergy as well as the Buddhist laity in Korea. And even in the 1980s, you remember there was another Korean leader called President Chun Du-hwang, who was a Methodist, and he adopted many anti-Buddhist policies, all right, and restricted Buddhist activities. In fact, what happened is many historic temples were converted into tourist resorts, therefore depriving temples of their autonomy and, of course, of their financial support. So this went on for actually many years, and you find that while the Christian population increased, in Korea, the Buddhist population began to decrease, and historians were saying that Korea would probably end up as the first Asian country to be predominantly Christian, other than the Philippines. But fortunately, there was a Buddhist revival in Korea, and this started actually way back in the 80s, in the late 70s, when Buddhism expanded because of education and the media. So Buddhists decided to set up what is called the Buddhist broadcasting system, starting Buddhist television network, and starting to promote Buddhism through the mass media, through the media, as well as having studying universities. I think today there are 3 Buddhist universities, 26 Buddhist schools, and more than 15 Buddhist seminaries all over Korea. And fortunately, you even have the Korean Zen tradition, which has now been exported to the West. all right? For example, the Kwanum School of Zen. Some of you may have heard of Sung Sang, Venerable Sung Sang, right? He was one of those who actually promoted Korean Buddhism to the West. So Japan, okay? So Japan, the Korean king of Pakche sent gifts of Buddha images and Buddhist texts to Japanese gods. So where did Buddhism, or where did the Japanese got Buddhism from? Did he get it from China? All right, he got it from Korea. From China, it went to Korea. From Korea, it went to Japan. All right, so soon Buddhism was accommodated along with Shinto beliefs. Right, you know, when Buddhism went to Japan, there was already Shintoism, which was the indigenous religion, but it was Prince Shotoku. So if you study Japanese history, you remember this name Shotoku, who promoted Buddhism. He built temples, created works of art, and he sent monks to China to study. Okay. Now, Buddhism reached its height during the Nara period. All right. Those of you who have been to Japan, you go to Osaka. From Osaka, you can take a short train ride. You visit Nara. So Nara is a site where the flowering of, or the flourishing of Buddhism in Japan. Right? You also find the Todaji, the wooden temple. So Buddhist scriptures were copied, distributed. Chinese monks started to arrive, and many Chinese schools and Buddhism were introduced from Japan. Now, what is interesting is that all the Buddhist schools that you have in China, early on I mentioned to you about the Pure Land School, and I mentioned to you about the Chan School, I mentioned to you about Tiantai, I mentioned to you about Avatamsaka, or the Huayan. So all these 4 schools you also find in modern Japan today. All right, the Pure Land School in Japan, in China is you know, you have the Pure Land, but in Japan you also have the Pure Land. So it's called Shin, Jodo Shin and Jodo Shinshu, for example. You also have got the Chan School, which is the meditation school. So in Japan it became the Zen Buddhism. Just as in China you have got 2 main schools of Zen. So likewise in Japan, you have got the Soto Zen, you also have got the Rinzai Zen, and a much smaller one called Obaku Zen, right? So 2 main schools. So likewise, you also have got Tiantai from Tiantai Mountains in China. So in Japan, it's called Tendai Buddhism, all right? Where the focus or the emphasis is on the Lotus Sutra. And likewise, you have the Avatamsaka school, the Huayan in China. So when it went to Japan, it became known as the Qigong school, all right? Now, there's one additional school, Buddhist school in Japan, which did not originate from China, and I think you could easily guess, and that's the Nichiren school, Nichiren Shoshu, all right? So there are 5 major schools of Buddhism in Japan. 4 of it you can trace back to China, okay? So again, I'm going to skip that because of time, but 2 names here, Saicho and Kukai. All right, I mentioned about Tiantai. So Tiantai school, you associate with Saicho, and Shingon will be the tantric school from China to Japan. That's Kukai, all right? So Kamakura, so just some names as you can see with the slides there. Honen founded the Jodo school. Jodo school is the Pure Land school in China, where the belief in the Amitabha. So Amitabha in China is Amitofo. So Amitabha in Sanskrit. So in Japan, Amitabha becomes Amida. So Amida Butsu, for example, praying to Amida. And then his disciple, Shinran, founded Jodo Shinshu, which is the pure, the Pure Land school. Right? So Nichiren, as I founded the True Lotus school. Dogen is of course Zen school. So in China, you have also 2 schools of Chan, and Dogen and Esai. So Soto and Rinzai. Okay. Now, let me go on very quickly now to Tibet. Now, Tibet is the history of Buddhism in Tibet started with King Songtsen Gampo of Tibet. Okay, he married a Nepali princess and a Chinese princess who were Buddhists. Soon he too became Buddhist, and he sent emissaries to India and China to bring back Buddhist texts. So it is said in the 8th century, King Trisong Detsen invited Santarakshita from India to Tibet. The majority of Tibetans rejected Buddhism when Santarakshita came. Again, there's a long history. It's not possible for me to explain why this happened, but it's because Santarakshita was a very good monk, a scholar monk, but when he went to to Tibet at that time, the majority of Tibetans rejected Buddhism because there was an indigenous religion in Tibet at that time called the Bon religion. And the local people said, look, you know, our religion, our Bon religion is far more superior to your religion. So Santa Rakshita, he was a great monk, he was an erudite scholar. So he thought that now I need something different to overcome this pride or this false concept of Buddhism that these local people have about Buddhism. So he invited Padmasambhava. So Padmasambhava was supposed to be, you know, the second Buddha. So he came and then he was able to convert the local Tibetans into Buddhism. But that's a long story. So we won't have time. Okay. So he was able to remove. Now, so it is said that together with Padmasambhava, Santa Rakshita helped establish the teachings of the Mahayana and Vajrayana firmly in Tibet. Now, again, we don't have time, but I just want to mention a very brief point here. The word Mahayana, the Tibetan tradition also used Mahayana when they are talking about the Sutra tradition, because in Tibetan Buddhism, they've got both the Sutra tradition and the Tantric tradition. So when it comes to the Sutra tradition, they're talking about the Mahayana. But when they talk about the Tantric tradition, that's when they move into the Vajrayana. So sometimes you will find that a Tibetan would say that, oh, we are also Mahayana, which is correct, okay? Now, so Buddhism was also persecuted in Tibet. So just like in many other countries where Buddhism went to, so like in the 9th century, Buddhism was persecuted by King Langdharma. And many Tibetans, because of that, you know, they felt that the purity of the Dhamma was lost. Just as King Mongkut felt that in Thailand, something has to be done to revive Buddhism, and King Mongkut instituted the Thamayut monastic order. So in Tibet, then subsequently, the Tibetans they decided to invite Indian scholars to come to Tibet to revive Buddhism. And news spread that there was a very great scholar, we should invite him. And his name was Atisha. And where was Atisha? Remember I talked about Indonesia? Atisha was studying in Sumatra for 10 years. Atisha was in Sumatra studying with Serlingpa, all right, who was his teacher. So Atisha then came to Tibet and he revived Buddhism in Tibet. Okay, so today, unfortunately, I don't think you can find much Buddhism in Tibet. All the great teachers, the great Lama, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama, including His Holiness the 17 Karmapa, they have all left Tibet. They are all in northern India, and they are now safeguarding the great Tibetan tradition in India and in the West. Okay, so when we come to the next topic on Buddhism in the West, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's talk about the last few part on USA. The first Buddhist temple in the US was built in 1853 in San Francisco by a Chinese Buddhist fraternal group called the Siyap family, or Siyap company, followed by a second temple a year later built by another similar group. In Hawaii, after repeated requests from Japanese Buddhists, the first Jodo Shinshu priests. You remember Jodo Shinshu? So Jodo Shinshu is the Pure Land school in Japan, all right? The head temple in Nara, I think in Hongwanji, right? Arrived at Honolulu in 1889. So after the first service, he went to Hilo to establish Hawaii's first Buddhist temple in 1889. So Hawaii, all right, has got a large Japanese Buddhist population, as one could imagine. Now, the World Parliament of Religions in 1893, during the Chicago World Fair, was a key event in the transmission of Buddhism to the West. Now, it was in this very important occasion, World Parliament of Religions, that you have three names. One is Shaku Soen, a Japanese Zen master, Anagarika Dhammapala, the name I mentioned when I talk about Sri Lanka, and they were two of the participants. They later returned to the US to give lectures on Buddhism. Now, what is important about Shaku Soen is that his student by the name of Dr. D.T. Suzuki, all right, later became a leading spokesman of Zen in the West. If you if you're born in the 50s, or you're born in the 40s, all right, then you would remember that in the early 60s, you got names like Dr. D.T. Suzuki, you got names like Alan Watts. Right? These are the people who promoted Zen Buddhism in the West. All right. So the first form of Buddhism that actually became strong in Buddhism was actually Zen, Japanese Zen. And also it was a time when many Japanese servicemen, after having served in Japan at the end of World War II, they came back to the United States, and because of their contact with Japanese Zen Buddhism, so they became interested in Buddhism in America. Names like Philip Caplio, for example. All right. So all these are people who contributed to Zen Buddhism in the United States in the 50s and early 60s. All right. A popular book at that time was The Three Pillars of Zen by Philip Caplio. All right. So many people, many Americans, they would be able to, to understand the importance of Zen at that time. Now, then you have another school called the Japanese Pure Land School. So there's another group called the Buddhist Churches of America, BCA. Now, I'm not sure you have heard of BCA, but one of the things that Malaysia actually benefited from the Buddhist Churches of America, Buddhist hymns. Right, today, before the start of this talk, you had Victor and the team singing a series of Buddhist hymns. Way back in the 50s and the 60s, Buddhist hymns was a rare commodity. And the first time Buddhists in Malaysia actually, at those days, heard about Buddhist hymns, who actually, they sound very much like Christian jingles, because they were actually created by the Buddhist Churches of America, right, to be used in Buddhist Sunday schools. So from that, Malaysia, Singapore, we became to develop our own Buddhist hymns. All right, so you have hymns those days from people like Victor Wee, Tan Huat Chai, O Kim Leng, and so on. Right. So you trace back. Actually, it came from the Buddhist Churches of America. Okay. Now, so I think I'll just skip this. I just want to mention. In the 70s, you have got the Beat Generation, the 70s, all right? So you got names like, this was when Vipassana became very popular in the United States, okay? So you have names like Joseph Goldstein, Jack Confield, Sharon Salzberg. I'm sure some of you would, those of you who are in practicing Vipassana, you would probably have heard of these names. And today, when we talk about mindfulness in the West, this name, Jon Kabat-Zinn, right, automatically comes to mind. Today, mindfulness meditation is a common term. All right, people use the word mindfulness. So, I'll tribute to Jon Kabat-Zinn, who pioneered innovative applications of mindfulness meditation. All right, so that's in the United States. Now, the 1980s marked the rise of Tibetan Buddhism in the U.S. All right, so today, all right, I remember our late chief Kesari Dhammananda, once he was telling us, once he was at the immigration in Chicago, I think he was saying. So the immigration officer looked at him and said, "Oh, what are you, a Buddhist monk?" He said, "Yes, I'm a Buddhist monk." And the next question is, "Are you Dalai Lama?" Okay, so the 1980s marked the rise of Tibetan Buddhism, especially after His Holiness the Dalai Lama received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989. And subsequent to that, many Tibetan Lamas, they began to teach in the US, including Lama Yeshe, Kalu Rinpoche, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, and the 16th Karmapa. And of course, most recently, the 17th Karmapa. He also went to the United States to teach at the universities and at very prestigious universities. Of course, in the US, you also have Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Zen master who travels regularly from France. His base is in France to teach mindfulness retreats. Okay, so, and of course, Buddhism gained even higher profile in the West in the later part of the 20th century because of celebrities and artists. You name it, Leonard Cohen, Richard Gere, Herbie Hancock, Phil Jackson, Patrick Duffy, Harrison Ford. Who doesn't know Harrison Ford? Right? Keanu Reeves, Sharon Stone, Uma Thurman, Angelina Jolie, and even the Pulitzer Prize winner, Alice Walker. All of them openly shared that they are influenced by Buddhism. Okay, so all this created great interest in Buddhism in the West. Now, there's so much to talk about it. time is running and I have to end very soon to give some time for Q&A. I would recommend you to read this book if you're really interested to find out how Buddhism went to the West. It's called How the Swans Came to the Lake by Rick Fields. Wonderful book. Europe, okay, last few slides. Interest in Buddhism had already started in the 1870s with people like Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche. It was because of Friedrich Nietzsche that Hitler had a distorted view of the swastika, right? You will remember the German, when Hitler, you know, his symbol was a swastika, which was actually a Buddhist symbol. So again, I don't have time to talk to you about the details, but you could see there was a link, but he distorted the whole thing. The word swastika means to be well, but when Hitler uses the swastika, nothing went well. Right? That's why you got the Second World War. But Buddhism in Europe started from the academic circles, people like Friedrich Nietzsche and Arthur Schopenhauer. Right? Those two names are great Western philosophers. Right? Now, Pali Text Society was also founded in the 19th century by a British, all right? And it's because of the Pali Text Society that today we have actually the Buddhist texts in the Theravada canon all translated into English, all right? And that actually led to a lot of introduction of Buddhism to Europe as well as back to Asia, right? So the Pali Text Society is chosen. And then the first Buddhist temple was a Kalmyk, of course, in Yugoslavia. You know, I'll just skip that. Right? So you have my slide, so it's in your spare time you can read that. I just want to mention three names, which I think I briefly mentioned earlier on in Sri Lanka: Ñāṇatiloka, Ñāṇaponika. So they were among the first Europeans to become Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka. And Ñāṇatiloka compiled the Buddhist dictionary. Okay, so Ñāṇamoni, all right, that's the other one, and Ñāṇaponika, Buddhist Publication Society. Now, in the 60s, Akong Tuku Rinpoche, Chokyam Trungpa, again, some of you may be familiar with Chokyam Trungpa, the Shambhala tradition, all right? So he founded Samye Ling, which is the first Tibetan Buddhist monastery in the West. And Thich Nhat Hanh founded Plum Village in France. So these are very important centers which disseminate Buddhism, both from the Tibetan as well as the Vietnamese Zen tradition. Of course, in the Thai forest tradition, the Amaravati, all right? This is also in UK. You have Ajahn Sumedho, who is Chao Kun, right? Chao Kun Sumedho, no? Or Longpo Chao Kun Sumedho, all right? So Ajahn Sumedho has also handed the abbotship to Ajahn Amaro now, who is the co-abbot of Bayagiri. So Europe, you have many monasteries. Okay, so I'm afraid I've overshot my time because there's so much that I would like to share with you when it talks about expansion of Buddhism. But I also realized that I should leave some time in case there are some questions or some comments. All right, so I think we have about 15, maybe 20 minutes the most. Right? So thank you very much, and we can have some questions.
So thank you very much, Brother Benny. There's a lot of questions. I think I summarized it few there. Can you click your there is a closed caption on the bottom of your list. Is closed caption.
Let me see, where's my closed caption?
See, right? In your Zoom.
Yeah, I'm trying to find. Is it under the chat? No.
Maybe what you do is you unshare first.
Maybe I have to.
You don't share your.
Yeah,
stop sharing.
I'll stop sharing. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I see chats. There are like 20. Yeah.
Yep.
Yes. Yeah. I see those questions there. So, well, we'll need the whole night, you know, to answer those questions. So, which question should I start with?
Okay, I type it for you now. You prefer latest chat. Okay.
Soka Gakkai, is it? Is that the first question?
How many types of Buddhism are out there?
How many types of Buddhism, right? Well, basically, we said there are two main traditions, which is the Theravada tradition and the Mahayana tradition, right? Two main traditions, right? Sometimes they are called as the the Southern school and the Northern school, right? The Southern school is the Theravada tradition. Southern school because it is mainly found in Sri Lanka, Burma, Cambodia, Laos, parts of Vietnam. Now the Mahayana tradition, as I said, we usually associate with East Asia, right? China, Korea, Japan, Mahayana Buddhism. But Tibetan Buddhism is also a branch of Mahayana Buddhism. As I mentioned to you just now, Tibetan Buddhism has got both Mahayana and Vajrayana. In Tibetan Buddhism, when they focus on the sutras, for example, the Mahayana Prajnaparamita Sutras, all right, then that's the Mahayana part. But when they go into tantric aspects, then that is the Vajrayana. Okay, so Vajrayana is seen as a part of the Mahayana. Okay, all right. So that is why, for example, Lama Yeshe's group, Lama Zopa's group, the name of their organization is called FPMT, right? Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition. But it's led by Lama Zopa, who is a Tibetan monk. All right. Okay, so you understand why Tibetan Buddhism also considered themselves as Mahayana, because they also focus on the sutra tradition. Yes, what's the next question?
Okay, next question is, isn't Sri Vijaya period was more of Vajrayana tradition than Mahayana?
Yes, yes. It also have, again, when the focus is on the sutras, then it falls under the Mahayana, you see? Because one who practices Vajrayana doesn't ignore the Mahayana, neither do they ignore the Theravada. For example, I always remember His Holiness Dalai Lama when I met His Holiness Dalai Lama many years ago, and he said that all students of Tibetan Buddhism must start by studying the Pali Canon, because that is the foundation. That is the very fundamental. No, you cannot talk about Vajrayana, you cannot talk about Mahayana, you don't understand what is found in the Pali Canon. So the Pali Canon is very important. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama wrote the same thing in his foreword to the book by Bhikkhu Bodhi called, if you read the book called In the Buddha's Words, some of you, I'm sure you have this text called In the Buddha's Words. Read that forward, what His Holiness says about the Pali Canon. All right? So it's very important, whatever tradition that we follow, to not forget to understand, to have a full grasp of the Pali Canon. Okay? So, yeah, which question should I pick now?
Okay, there's a next question from regarding Sona and Uttara, a Buddhist monk from which country and introduced which Buddhism, a Buddhist tradition to Malaysia?
Well, they are from India. We're not too sure which tradition. For example, if you look back at Nalanda University, it is said that basically all schools of Buddhism have been practiced there. Okay.
The next question is, please advise, is there a good book to read about the spread of Buddhism in Asia?
In Asia. Well, the spread of Buddhism, you know, it extends. So if you're talking about an early period, then I recommend George Sedez, C-O-E-D-E-S, George Sedez. Now, that book talks about the Indianized kingdoms of Southeast Asia. So if you read that book, then it will be able to, then it gives you a good background. The other book you can consider is Quaritch Wells, Quaritch, W-E-L, Quaritch Wells, all right? You can Google that, all right? Quaritch Wells. Okay. So he has got a couple of books there. Now, if you're talking about modern aspects of Buddhism in Asia, I think you have to go country by country. Okay.
There's a next question from regarding, it was stated. Yeah.
It was stated that Gautama Buddha gave it. Well, you know, there are a lot of legends. All right, I really do not know. maybe it happened. I really do not know. So I won't be able to answer you that question. Okay. What's the next? Is there a next question? Okay. I think there's this question about, is the oldest Buddhist text, is it the Pali text, right? Now, apparently there's some research been made, and they say that there's this Gandhara text. So there are some texts which is not necessary from the Pali text. You know, in the Pali text, we have this sutta called the Khagga Visana Sutta, right? Which, you know, have you heard of Khagga Visana Sutta, the rhinoceros sutta, which is found in the Sutta Nipata, right? But you also have got the Gandhara text, right? So there's also a similar rhinoceros sutta in the Gandhara text. So apparently, according to historians, it is much older than the Pali text. So I think as historians continue to do research, archaeological excavations, you'll find that more and more, there are more and more texts, okay? Right. How does Falun Gong rise in China? I do not know anything about Falun Gong, right? Other than the fact that every time I'm in Europe, I will find groups of Falun Gong people protesting. I really do not know about Falun Gong. Right? Okay, so I wanted to answer you that question. Can we confirm that Malaysia was the land where Venerable Uttara and Sona came to? Well, according to Chinese records, yeah, these two monks came here. The Suvarna Bhumi title was also claimed by Burma and Thailand, yes. Suvarna Bhumi means the land of gold, right? Golden Kesanis, isn't it? For example, the airport in Bangkok is also called Suvarna Bhumi, right? Okay, so they claim that land. Yeah. Okay, then the question is, you want to know is whether Buddhism is a religion or a philosophy or a teaching or is a way of life. I think it's everything. As I said, you can add one more. His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, Buddhism is a science of, is mind science, right? It's a mind science. It is a religion. If you look at the word religion, religare, it means something that brings people together. Well, religion, of course, as Buddhism, like today, we bring everybody together. So in that sense, it is a religion. Is Buddhism a philosophy? What does the word philosophy? It comes from the word philosophia. Sophia means philosophy, love of wisdom. Sophia means wisdom, so love of wisdom. So is Buddhism a love of wisdom? Yes, we all study the Dhamma, we all practice the Dhamma, we all hope to realize. What do we hope to realize? We hope to realize prajna or panya, right? Wisdom, isn't it? So that's philosophy. Is it a way of life? Of course it's a way of life. We practice the 5 precepts. We make the 5 precepts our way of life. Okay, is it a mind science, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama says? I think it is. All right. When we understand that a lot of our problems originate with our mind. In the Dhammapada, the first verse says that mind is a forerunner of all things. Isn't it so? So it's a mind science. So Buddhism is everything, in that sense. So do we recognize the Dhammakaya sect in Thailand as belonging to the vast religiosity of Buddhism? Well, it's not for me to recognize the Dhammakaya sect. The Dhammakaya is a lineage in Thailand, just as the Santi Asok is, right? Okay, so I think the Dhammakaya sect it still exists in Thailand. I'm not sure whether is it regarded as illegal. Now, what is the difference between the various schools of Buddhism? That will take us another 2 hours to talk what's the difference. We should in fact talk about what is the similarities, isn't it? The similarities is that all schools of Buddhism teaches us 3 very important things: avoid evil, do good, purify the mind. Whether you call yourself a Theravada, you call yourself Mahayana, you call yourself Vajrayana, you have been asked to avoid evil. That means keep your precepts. Whether you're Theravada, Mahayana, or Vajrayana, you still have the precepts. All right, you have the 5 precepts. All right, and then you avoid evil, you do good. Whether you're Theravada, Mahayana, or Vajrayana, you still have the 4 Brahma Viharas. Dr. Alan Wallace, who is a well-known Tibetan Buddhist teacher, he always likes to to teach the 4 Brahma Viharas, which is a traditional Theravada text. All right, he wrote books about the 4 immeasurables. He calls them the 4 immeasurables. So it doesn't matter. You do good, you practice loving kindness, you practice compassion, you develop sympathetic joy, and you cultivate equanimity. And you purify the mind. Every school of thought in Buddhism, whether Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, have got samatha, have got vipassana. So vipassana is not the preserve of Theravada Buddhism. Neither is shamatha the preserve of Vajrayana Buddhism. So all schools of Buddhism have got have got vipassana, have got shamatha. All right. So what is the difference? There are obviously differences because there are cultural differences. When Buddhism goes to Thailand, the Buddha image looks like the Thai king. When Buddhism goes to Thailand, the way they chant the suttas is very different from the way the Burmese would chant the suttas. Okay, so there are differences, but those differences are actually the external forms. What is common is the intrinsic teachings. All right, but what is the intrinsic teaching? 4 Noble Truths. All right, is 4 Noble Truths the preserve of the Theravada? Yes, the 4 Noble Truths was taught by the Buddha. The first discourse, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Buddha taught. There you found the 4 Noble Truths. So those of us who practice Theravada think that, oh, that is the sacred text of the Theravada. It's also the sacred text of the Tibetans. His Holiness the Dalai Lama loves to give teachings on the 4 Noble Truths, which is based on the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. So they are the same. All right, in that sense. How strongly or weakly is Mahayana related to the Mahasamghika sect? Okay, this is another long answer. How strongly or weakly is Mahayana to the Mahayana? Well, it is said that the Mahayana originated from the Mahasamghika. All right, so it is said. So there is some historical reference to the Mahayana tradition as originating from the Mahasamghika sect. Okay. Okay. All right. So let's not worry too much about the differences. Let's see what are the similarities, and then let's see how we can practice that. You know, when Atisha went to Tibet, all right, the local Tibetans asked Atisha. He said, Atisha, you know, there's so many different teachings, so many different forms of Buddhism. How do we practice? Atisha says, you pick what is useful for you to cultivate your mind. What is useful for you to overcome your defilements. You practice that. That is real Buddhism. Right? Okay. Is Soka Gakkai considered a Buddhist society? Well, Soka Gakkai, it means a value-creating society. It is actually the lay group of the Nichiren. Just now I mentioned to you Nichiren, right? There are 5 main Buddhist schools in Japan. There's one group called the Nichiren School, founded by Nichiren Daishonin. So Soka Gakkai is actually a lay movement. All right? It was originally part of the Nichiren group, right? The Nichiren, but subsequently is split off, is a lay group. Okay, the head of Soka Gakkai is a lay person, Daisaku Ikeda. So he's not a monk, but in the Nichiren school they've got monks, they've got priests, they got monks. All right, but the Soka Gakkai, they also follow the Nichiren text. For example, they pray to the Lotus Sutra, so that's a Nichiren school. Okay, it's a very popular tradition in the United States among Buddhists. Right, you know, again you got Tina Turner, who is a great proponent of the Soka Gakkai. The Japanese Parliament, you know, in the Japanese Parliament, the junior partner of the Liberal Democratic Party is a political party called Komito. Now, Komito is actually originating from the Nichiren group. All right, so there's a lot of links. So Soka Gakkai is a very, very influential Tibetan group. Sorry, a very influential Japanese Nichiren lay group. Okay. Yeah. Is there? Why do we need to know the history of how Buddhism is spread to each and every country? Well, you don't need to know that, all right? But because this is, I suppose this is part of the course, so we just thought it's just kind of a bird's eye view. So you don't really need to know the history of how Buddhism spread from each country to country. At the end of this series of lessons, which stream of Buddhism will be covered in practice? I think in this model, we are not talking specifically about which stream, because the participants could be from various schools of thought. Some of you could be practicing in the Mahayana, some of you could be practicing in the Theravada, so that's fine. You know, I don't think it's our intention to convince you that at the end of this course you should follow this particular school of thought, right? Okay, I think it's almost time. It's already time now. Maybe one last question. Let me see. Okay, so I think that's basically. So there are so many Buddhist different schools now. So do they all maintain some core teaching? Yes. The Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths, that's the core teaching. You can't run away from that. Whatever school of thought that you follow, if that particular teacher or monk tells you, in my tradition, there's no Four Noble Truths, then you know that you're not attending a Buddhist tradition. All right. As I said, Four Noble Truths is found in the first discourse, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, right? So we tend to think, oh, that's a Theravada text. But it's as popular, as widespread in the Chinese Mahayana as well as in the Tibetan. Right? So that's the core text, the Four Noble Truths, right? Okay. So thank you very much. I think it's already past 10, right? Thank you very much. Okay, may you all be well and happy, and may you all be well and safe too. Okay, please.
Thank you, Mahasadu to Brother Benny. Okay, thank you to all of you for coming in today. We hit almost about 200 over, more than 250 over participants today. It's good. We'll see you next week. Okay, with a different speaker. And this series, they are altogether eight topics. Okay, there's, as I say, there's no purpose of it's more general knowledge. As a Buddhist, we need to understand the history behind. So by knowing history, basically we intend to learn from mistake. Okay, what are the things that we should not do, and how can we further improve ourselves, strategize, improve ourselves to spread the Dhamma to all people. Okay, so with that, thank you very much, and sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Good night.
Okay, good night. Any problem?